So we're in Arizona, and the water has a lot of minerals in it. They're very corrosive. And what I've got is a pool fence where you can see it's corroded there. And that's from the sprinkler system coming up off of the grass and keeping this wet every time the sprinklers go off. And this is a metal tubing fence. Looks like we're about a 2-inch square tubing. And I haven't been able to find anybody that's willing to repair this, so I kind of came up with my own solution on how to fix this. So in order to get a good idea about how far the corrosion is and how bad it is, I'm going to use this pneumatic scaler. This is Ingersoll Rand. I think I got this at Amazon for about $140 or so. I'm going to be using a full face mask, keep the chips out of my face and eyes, and so I'm going to take this scale off and we'll take a look at the metal and see how much has to be cut out. Okay, well, that took about 3 minutes with the scaler, and I think I'm going to cut it back about an inch back, maybe a ½ inch above, 3/4 above this horizontal piece, and then we'll show you what the next step is. One thing I would say is when you're using that scaler, in addition to eye protection, wear some earplugs. That thing is loud on that metal. Okay, so we're going to use the break out the DeWalt portable here, cordless, and I've got a carbide tipped metal blade. Thought I had a brand name on there. I want to say Diablo or something like that, but we're going to give this a shot here, and I'll make my cuts, and then we'll measure for the new pieces. So after the cuts, this is what we're left with. That took less than 60 seconds to make both cuts probably. I'll take a file and I'll take the burr off of this cut edge all the way around, so that I'll be able to, got another piece of tubing that's going to telescope or slide over both this 1-inch piece and the 2-inch piece. Alright, so we're ready to mark and cut these pieces. And so what I've got is some 1¼ inch tubing, and that will slide right over the top of this 1-inch tubing. And then I've got 2¼ square tubing, and that'll slide right over the outside of this 2-inch tubing. So that'll telescope nicely. So I've got a plate, a 1/4 inch plate, that's going to go on the base and cover this hole. And I'll drill some anchor bolt holes into the 4 corners. And that's going to slide in under this 2-inch piece. And that'll form the base. And then we'll, so I'll mark this length based on the plate not being in place. That way I can slide this piece on and then slide the plate underneath it. But because I can't move this too much, I can't lift it, this piece has to be measured pretty closely. So I'll mark that pretty close, and then we'll get that cut, fit together. Okay, so here's the pieces are cut. We're dry fit them together. I'll put a plumb bob or a level on this post and make sure it's lined properly. It's already kind of fixed in place, so we can't go too far. But for aesthetics, I'll make sure it's lined up properly. We'll put everything together. Having this plate separate there lets me slide that around and pick the location for my anchor bolt holes. I'll stay away from the edges as much as I can. Don't have a lot of edges there to avoid, but we'll see what we can do. And then if this is exposed, I'll fill this with some mortar or something there to fill that in. And then the idea here is to seal this all the way around, and then I think I'm going to paint it with Flex Seal, and then I'll put a cover over that of regular paint if the Flex Seal will take paint. If it won't, then I'll just find a good outdoor rust prohibitive paint and we'll go with that. So I've got the holes drilled for the anchor bolts. I've tried to stay away from the edges of the brick. I'm going to drill those holes a little oversized, put some epoxy in them, and when I use the expanding anchors, that way it won't put as much pressure on the side of the brick, less likely to split that brick is what I'm trying to avoid. And when the epoxy sets, that'll hold it in there. All the force on this post is going to be up and down. The rest of the fence is going to keep it from moving laterally. So really it's just the up and down motion, actually pressure down on it. I just want to prevent it from being able to be rocked back and forth. Once that epoxy sets on those anchor bolts, that'll do the job. So what I'm going to do now is I've got my level on here as far as being plumb. Looks like the fence is being pushed out at the top a little bit maybe, and rather than trying to make this deviate too much from the rest of the fence, I'm just going to let it seek its own level that way. It'll be less noticeable if it's the same slight angle as the rest of the fence, I believe. Anyway, looks good this way. I've got everything drilled. I've done a dry fit. I took some 80 grit sandpaper and cleaned up the weld lines, get as much of that rust and paint off as I can so I can get a good weld with the little MIG welder, wire welder. And so now I've just got to drag an extension cord out here in the welder, and we'll go around as much of this as I can. I don't think I can get underneath this thing, but I'll seal that real good with the Flex Seal once it's welded and cooled, and that should do the trick, I would think. Anyway, it'll do what I need to do. Alright, so I have finished the welding, and yes, I know it's ugly. It's flux core, and I don't do this for a living, but here's what I know. I'm going to cover it up with Flex Seal, and nobody's going to know the difference. So I'll wire brush this, clean that film and flux off of it, and then we'll give it a final coat with Flex Seal and call it done. I will drill the anchor bolt holes with a little hammer drill and a carbide masonry bit, and then we'll get those in there with some epoxy on it, blow them out with air, make sure we don't have any loose dust or material, drill them, make sure I've got them plenty deep, and then fill them with epoxy and put those anchors in and just barely tap them into place, just to lock them in place while the epoxy sets. So cleaned it up. I think what I'm probably going to do is take a flap sander and maybe take off some of the high points on those welds. A little sloppy in some areas, and of course got a lot of spatter because it's that flux core wire and that stuff is nasty. And then we'll drill our holes. I've got the 4 holes in there. I've just got those anchors part way in there just to hold the alignment while I drilled. This is what I'm using. These hammer set 1.5 by 1/4. I've got the holes drilled. That's probably the hardest part about this whole process. And now I'll go mix up some JB weld, drop it into the hole there, and then I will tap those in place. I'll use a chisel on the edge and tap them down fully into the hole, and then I'll use a hammer to tap the wedge into place just until it feels snug. I should be able to tap it all the way in. The holes are a little bit oversized, so I don't think I'm too worried about splitting the brick. I've already done a couple of these and they seem to work okay. And then I use the canned air to blow the rock dust out of the way. Probably should wear a mask. Don't breathe that stuff, it's nasty. And so we'll do that, and then we'll be ready to put the Flex Seal on it. Okay. So we've got our anchors in place. You still see a little bit of the JB weld around the edges there. We'll let that dry a little bit, and then after that is set up, we'll give it hour or so to set up, and then we'll give it a quick coat with the Flex Seal. I'll probably hit it again and take a little bit more of this paint off. It looks like there's still a little loose paint and rust on there, and then we'll blow it off real good with the canned air. Right. Got it all painted up. Kind of a sloppy job around the edges because it's kind of thick and it wants to ooze. I'm going to come back after it dries and we'll do any cleanup that I can. I'll run probably a bead of caulk around there if that Flex Seal doesn't flow into the cracks well enough. But it's a kind of a problem area, so I'm more interested in making sure it's protected, and I'll touch it up with some brown paint when I repaint the fence. Alright, that's it. I probably have about 2.5 hours in the project altogether.